Well, aloha everyone, and welcome back to Anatomy 151 here at Chaminade University. Today we will be covering the topic of sensation and perception. Now this is where the textbooks get a little bit wonky in terms of chapter numbers, so depending on which textbook you're using, this might be chapter 15, it might be chapter 16. I'm going to call it Unit 15 just to keep things in order, but in the textbook that I'm using it's actually chapter 16. But let's hop right in here. So, sensation is a conscious or subconscious awareness of your external and internal stimuli, and the change in the external and internal environment is perceived by the conscious interpretation of these sensations. So, perception is the conscious interpretation of sensations that's performed mainly by a particular part of the brain called the cerebral cortex. Now, we have what's called sensory modalities, which means that we have unique types of sensation, such as pain, touch, vision, or hearing, and each of these individually are called their own sensory modality. Now, sensory modalities are grouped into two major groups. One, the general senses, which we will discuss today, and two, the special senses, which we will pick up with in Anatomy 152. So we will not cover that topic this semester. The general senses are going to include your tactile senses, your somatic senses, which include tactile, thermal, and proprioceptive. You might say, what in the world does proprioceptive mean? And proprioception is just your interpretation of your surroundings. So it's the idea that when you're standing still and you shut your eyes, you still have a conscious awareness of what's to your left, what's to your right, what's in front of you and around you, because you are actually getting other information like your equilibrium, etc. So proprioception is basically your ability to determine what's up from down and what's your surroundings in the absence of basically taking in all of your cues from around you. We also have the visceral and pressure sensors. We have chemical sensors, stretch sensors, nausea sensors, hunger, temperature sensors, etc. So those are all going to go into the general senses. Now, overall, we need a specific process in order for sensation to occur. So the very first thing that has to happen is that we have to have a stimulus. So here we have, for example, a cold stimulus. That stimulus comes in, and again, a stimulus is any type of change in your environment. So this would be a temperature stimulus. And then we have a sensory receptor or an organ of some sort that's going to pick up that stimulus and then pass it on or transduce it or convert it into an action potential or graded potential. And that's going to happen here. It's going to generate this trigger. It generates this potential along the axon, which is then eventually going to propagate that into the central nervous system. And then inside the central nervous system, a part of the brain or the spinal column is going to take that information and integrate it into what we call sensory nerve impulses. Now, we have several different types of nerve endings. We have free nerve endings. For example, these are used to detect things like pain, temperature, tickle, and some touch. But we have other types of touch as well. So we have pressure stimulus that is going to be able to respond here to a pressure into what's called an encapsulated nerve ending. So we have free nerve endings. These are just going to be dendrites that are just going to be available in the surroundings to be able to pick up information like change in temperature, for example. And then we also have these specialty types of encapsulated nerve endings. Again, we have dendrites inside here, but we have an encapsulation. That means that anything that presses anywhere on that capsule is going to be passed on. And then this is a specialty type of sensory receptor. This is a taste receptor. We won't be talking about taste or smell or sight or hearing during this particular lecture. But if, for example, a sugar molecule triggers the taste receptor here on the tongue, that's going to end up sending information across from the synaptic vesicles in the form of neurotransmitters that get picked up by dendrites, etc., and send that information on. But no matter how it works, we have a stimulus that triggers an action or graded potential that gets passed down through the axon and propagates in the central nervous system. So that's kind of the overview of how sensation works. Just to get a little bit further along here, so again, we had those free dendrites that I showed a minute ago. This here is an encapsulated dendrite. So it's an encapsulated nerve ending, and that means that pressure that comes from any direction is going to trigger it. So it doesn't have to be specific to here. It can come from anywhere around that encapsulation. And encapsulated nerve endings are very important for detection of certain things like pressure, vibration, and certain types of touch. We also, again, I said we have special sensory receptors, and this is about as far as we're going to get into this today. We're going to save that. It gets an entirely own lecture for gustatory receptor cells. For example, those are found in your taste buds. We also have photoreceptors. That's rods and cones. Those are found in the retina of the eye. And hair cells also have receptors. They're in the inner ear, and these hair cells in the inner ear are involved in hearing. All right, so how does this work? basically we have receptors that are grouped based on where they're located and also on the origin of whatever stimuli that can activate them. So we have extero and interoreceptors. All right, so exteroreceptors are going to include things like hearing, vision, smell, taste, touch, pressure, vibration, pain, etc. We also have interoreceptors. Interoreceptors are going to monitor the internal environment. And then we also have proprioceptors. Proprioceptors, again, this is where you are relative to your surroundings. So proprioception is how you interact with your environment or how you feel you relate to your external environment. So proprioception is going to include proprioceptors that give you information about things like your body position, your muscle length, your position and your movement of your joints. Okay, so again, these receptors are classified based on their location, whether they're located at the surface of the body, they'd be exteroreceptors, whether they're located inside the body, such as blood vessels or visceral organs or muscles or the nervous system, they're called interoreceptors. And then proprioceptors are located at locations like muscles, tendons, joints, and the middle ear. We also are going to separate these out on the basis of the type of stimulus that they detect, right? So do they detect mechanical stimuli that would make them like a mechanoreceptor, or do they detect temperature that makes them a thermoreceptor? Noisy receptors detect pain, photoreceptors detect light, etc. And so we have somatic sensations and tactile sensations. So that's how we're going to split these up. So some types of somatic sensations include the tactile sensations like thermal, pain, and proprioceptive. Some tactile sensations, again, they include touch, pressure, vibration, itch, and tickle. So how does this work? Okay, so we have specific types of tactile receptors. And this is just the different types of them. So we have free nerve endings here. As I mentioned, the free nerve endings are not going to be encapsulated by anything. These are usually found on the surface. Right here's the epidermis. They sense things like temperature, right? Pain, itch, tickling, and warmth. Right, cold and warmth would be temperature. We also have mechanoreceptors. These are called tactile discs, and these are special types of discs. They contain what's called Merkel cells, and these guys actually are going to sense fine touch and pressure. They are going to be kind of free endings in a large tactile disc. So anything that touches here or here or here is going to register in the same tactile disc. We also have this Ruffini corpuscle. These are type 2 cutaneous mechanoreceptors. And then we have this lamellated corpuscles. These are the Pacini corpuscles. These are going to be much further down underneath the skin. In order for something to hit here, we're going to have either fast vibrations that shake the whole deal or senses deep pressure. And I missed one here. This is another touch receptor. This is the Meissner. I hope I said that right. Meissner corpuscle, and that's going to sense fine touch. So you might notice that a lot of these sense touch, but in different ways, right? So this is going to be fine touch and pressure, fine touch, pressure, and slow vibration, deep pressure, fast vibration. So these are all going to be different types of nerve endings that are found in the three major layers of your skin, right? The epidermis, dermis, and subq layers. All right, so we have two major types of pain sensations. We have fast pain and slow pain. Fast pain is perceived almost immediately. Picture stepping on a tack or something like that. And then what is going to happen is it's going to be an immediate pain, sharp pricking pain detected very, very immediately. We also have a slow pain. Picture this like a toothache, a nice long chronic burning or throbbing. It might not be super sharp, but it's going to last for a very long time. And that's going to be perceived for more than a second or longer after the stimulus. Additionally, we also have superficial somatic pain, which is going to occur right from the top of the surface. That's going to arise from your skin receptors. All pain receptors are known as nociceptors, just by the way. And pain is actually a very important function in the body. It serves a protective function by signaling that you have some sort of issue, right? A tissue damaging condition. And if you were to allow yourself to remain in the situation, you might end up having further damage. So it's actually better for you to receive the pain and have an immediate feeling that allows you to remove yourself from that situation than to linger in a situation that's going to cause you some damage. All right. So we again have those two different types. We have the superficial and deep. The deep somatic pain is going to include things like your skeletal muscles, your joints, your tendons, your fascia. So it's going to be deep inside. And we also have visceral pain. Visceral pain can be found in visceral organs or inside your inner body. And it generally presents just in the skin that overlies the organ. So sometimes you can have like pain that's actually kind of like a deferred pain, this visceral pain that is going to be appearing in a different region than exactly where it's located. So if the organs ache, sometimes the skin over top of the organ is going to ache because we have a little bit of visceral pain is going to have innervations that are going to overlie the organ and the skin that's over top of that organ. This is showing you where you might have what we call referred pain, or pain that can show up elsewhere in the body but actually can be from something else. And as you recall, when we go back to our dermatomes, remember we had different regions of the skin that are going to be sensitive to different types of touch and are going to run through different nerves, right? And so those nerves are going to relay that information to those particular regions. And so sometimes organs that are found in the same dermatome can actually defer pain to external regions of the skin. So if you end up with issues that are, for example, in this region that's depicted in yellow, that could be kidney problems, even though it's deferred pain on the outside of your hips. Right? If you have a heart attack, for example, sometimes it's shown on the inner arm. Why? Because those are the same innervations, and it's difficult for the body sometimes to separate those out. Again, proprioception is the process of recognizing the position of your body relative to your external surroundings. And proprioceptors are going to allow you to undergo the process of proprioception. And these are receptors that are found in your muscles and in your tendons. So proprioceptors are found in skeletal muscles and tendons in and around joints and in the inner ear. And in the inner ear, they're going to convey things like, for example, balance. And they're going to convey information related to your muscle tone, for example, the movement of your body parts and your body position. Now we have two different types of proprioceptors. We have muscle spindles and tendon organs. Now, muscle spindles are proprioceptors that are found in skeletal muscle, and they're responsible for monitoring the change in the length of the skeletal muscle and involved in the stretch reflex. Muscle spindles are going to consist of several slowly adapting sensory nerve endings that are going to wrap around specialized muscle fibers, usually in groups of 3 to 10, and these are called intrafusal muscle fibers. We also have muscle spindles, which are going to contain gamma neurons that are located at the end of the intrafusal fibers. And these are going to help adjust the tension of the muscle spindle as the length of the muscle changes. And this is going to allow the sensitivity of the muscle spindle to be maintained while the muscle is stretched. We also have tendon organs. So tendon organs are found at the junction of the tendon and a muscle, and their responsibility is to protect their tendons and all of the associated muscles from damage that occurs or can occur due to overstretching. And then last but not least, we also have joint kinesthetic receptors. And these are going to be present around the articular capsules of synovial joints. And they have 3 major types. One is free nerve endings and type 2 cutaneous mechanoreceptors. And these are going to be in the joint capsules and they respond to pressure. We also have, so that's going to be here responding to pressure. We also have lamellated corpuscles, which are going to help respond to acceleration and deceleration of the joints during motion, so that they are going to be aware of how quickly they are accelerating or decelerating. And then we also have joint ligaments that have receptors inside of them that are going to be similar to our tendon organs, and they're going to help protect against that excessive strain that we just talked about with the tendon organs, like the overstretching. So what does that look like? So here is kind of what I just told you about. So here we have a tendon organ. It's found in the tendon, and it's going to have these sensory nerve endings. These sensory nerve endings are going to send information up through sensory axons that are going to pass on information like stretch response, etc. We also have here this muscle spindle. It's a capsule of connective tissue, right? And again, inside there, we're going to have nerve endings that are going to detect stretch and going to, so intrafusal muscle fibers here, inside the intrafusal muscle fibers. We've got these little sensory nerve endings that again are going to be sending information up into the central nervous system, as well as receiving information down from the central nervous system. And that's going to help prevent the muscle from overstretching and also allow it to have a constant amount of tension as we are going through this stretching process. Okay, so somatic sensory pathways are a mechanism by which information is relayed from the somatic sensory receptors into the brain, and that's going to go through the cerebral cortex to the cerebellum, and it's going to actually cross through the primary somatosensory area as well. That's found in the cerebral cortex. And the pathways of the cortex are going to have thousands of sets of neurons, and the neurons are classified in 3 different ways: first, second, and third order neurons. And you'll see that I'm going to have them highlighted as we go through so you can kind of see which ones are which. But basically the major difference is that first order neurons are going to take information from the somatic receptors and conduct it into the brainstem or into the spinal cord, depending. Excuse me. Second order neurons are going to be responsible for sending impulses from either the brainstem or the spinal cord into the thalamus. And the third order neurons are going to conduct impulses from the thalamus into the primary somatosensory area in the cerebral cortex on the same side. Now, somatic sensory impulses are going to ascend into the cerebral cortex of the brain along three major pathways. The first is the posterior column medial lemniscus pathway. That's going to send all impulses from the limbs, trunk, neck, and posterior head. And that's going to include all pressure, vibration, and conscious proprioception. And again, it's going to end up in the cerebral cortex. Now, I'm going to kind of talk you through this. We have a lot on this slide. I'm showing you first and foremost here in red, the first, second, and third order neurons. And again, that just basically is saying that we're taking information from the somatic receptors, sending it into either the brain or the spinal column. That's first order. From the brain or the spinal column, we're sending it into the thalamus. That's second order. From the thalamus into the cerebral cortex. That's third order. Okay. And in black, I have the actual pathway that we are taking in this particular somatic sensory pathway. So this pathway is the posterior column medial lemniscus pathway, and that's basically going to be taking information in through, from the touch pressure receptors, etc., through the posterior column here. Then it's going to go up through the medial lemniscus and then into the somatosensory area of the cerebral cortex. So in this setup, cell bodies of the first order neurons are going to be found in the posterior root ganglia, that's back here, of the spinal nerves, and then axons of the first order neurons form that entire posterior column of the spinal cord. And that's going to include something called the gracile fasciculus, which we'll look at in a minute. And that's going to carry sensations, again, from the lower limbs and the lower trunk, also from the cuneate fasciculus. We'll talk about that in a minute. And that's all going to carry sensations from the upper limb, upper trunk, neck, and posterior head. That's all those first order ones. Now, our second order neurons are in the gracilo-cuneate nucleus of the medulla, so that's going to be headed up there. And then the axons of the second order neurons are going to cross to the opposite sides of the medulla and enter into the medial lemniscus. So that's here. So they're going to go, the medulla is here. From the medulla, they're going to cross the opposite side, medial lemniscus. And that's a very thin tract that extends all the way from the medulla into the thalamus, which is up in here. And then the third order neurons, of course, are going to go from the thalamus into the somatosensory area of the cerebral cortex. That's the first pathway. All right, the second pathway is called the anterolateral pathway, or the spinothalamic pathway. And that's going to take impulses from, or types of pain, temperature, itch and tickle from the limbs, the trunk, the neck, and the posterior head into the cerebral cortex. And again, we're going to see the same thing. We have first, second, and third order neurons. Again, we're taking sensation in through the first order neuron, running it to the either spinal column or, and then that's going to then run into the second order neuron. We're taking information from the spinal cord up into the thalamus. From the thalamus to the primary somatosensory area are going to be third order neurons. Okay, so cell bodies from the first order neurons are going to be found in the dorsal root ganglia, again, back in here. And then they're going to interact with the cell body of the second order neurons, and they're found in the posterior horns of the spinal cord. And then the axons from the second order neurons cross to the opposite side, and then are going to extend up into the thalamus. And then from there, axons of the third order are going to project from the thalamus into the primary somatosensory area in the cerebral cortex. All right, so I know that's a lot, but really basically the way that they're describing this is which of the different regions are these neurons are going to be passing through. The third pathway is the trigeminothalamic pathway. And that's going to carry tactile sensations for pain, temperature, etc. from the face and the anterior head. And the somatosensory impulses are going to eventually reach the cerebellum, of course, and they're going to do that through the spinocerebellar tracts. So what does that look like? Again, first, second, and third order neurons. In this case, we are going to have two examples of the second order neurons. It's actually going to be the same. It's just going to be kind of looped around. It's going to travel through more places, I guess is my point. And then we have a third order neuron. Again, here is going to take that information from the thalamus to the primary somatosensory area of the cerebral cortex. In this case, the cell bodies of the first order neurons are going to be in the trigeminal ganglion of the trigeminal cranial nerve. That's here. And then the second order neurons are going to be found either in the pons or in the medulla, and cross to the opposite sides of the pons or the medulla and ascend as the trigeminothalamic tract into the thalamus, which is up in here. The third order neurons are going to project from the thalamus out to the primary somatosensory area here in the cerebral cortex. Okay, so although we have multiple different pathways that get us there, they're all going to serve the same function. We're going to take information in terms of touch, pressure, vibration, etc., and we're going to pass them up through different parts of the brain, different parts of the spinal column into the brain to finally reach the primary somatosensory area of the cerebral cortex. Okay, so we also have postcentral gyri, and these are going to be found in specific regions in the parietal lobes of the brain, and they're going to be the sites of the primary somatosensory area. And each region of the area is going to receive sensory input from a different part of the body on the opposite side. So left brain, right side, right brain, left side. And what's interesting about this is that it doesn't look anything like a person because certain regions are given a lot more brain power than other regions, right? For example, your hands are given a lot more brain power because you have a lot more tactile sensation that comes in through your hands. But it's not just your hands, right? Your lips are given a lot more sensation power, for example, than the rest of your head, etc. And so this is just an overview. I'm never going to ask you specifically which region of the postcentral gyrus is going to be responsible for which of the parts of your body, but just to show you that we are able to map it and that specific areas of the cerebral cortex are going to receive somatic sensory input from particular parts of the body, whereas other areas of the cerebral cortex are going to provide information that's going to be output information for motion of those parts of the body. Okay? All right, so let's move on to the posterior spinocerebral tract and anterior spinal cerebral tract, which are going to be carrying what we call proprioceptive impulses. That means that are information relating to proprioception, or the awareness of your surroundings, into the cerebellum. All right, so we have here's the posterior column. I told you previously we were going to show you where the gracial fasciculus and the cuneate fasciculus is. So if this whole thing is the posterior column, the gracial fasciculus, and there's another one on the other side as well, is going to be the innermost section of the posterior column, and the cuneate fasciculus is going to be the outermost part of the posterior column. So there's two tracts in that posterior column, again, the cuneate fasciculus and the gracial fasciculus, and they're going to convey information from different regions. So it's going to convey nerve impulses for touch, pressure, vibration, and conscious proprioception from the upper limb, upper trunk, neck, and posterior head. Whereas the gracial fasciculus is going to carry impulses from touch, pressure, and vibration from the lower limbs and the lower trunk. But either way, they're passing information through first, second, and third order neurons, where they're going to end up innervating the somatosensory cortex. Right? We also have that lateral spinal thalamic tract that we talked about. That's going to be in a different region. Here's the lateral spinal and the anterior spinal thalamic tract. They're going to be more towards the anterior region of the spinal cord, towards that anterior fissure region. And again, the lateral will be more towards the outside, and the anterior more towards, the anterior region. And it's going to be responsible for conveying impulses for pain, for cold, warmth, tickle, etc., from the limbs, trunk, neck, and posterior head. All right, so we also have the trigeminothalamic. That's going to be found here, showing you as cross-section through the pons. These are going to convey information for touch, pressure, vibration, cold, pain, warmth, itch, and tickle from which regions? Face, nasal cavity, oral cavity, and teeth. So this is all the facial nerve areas, basically. And the first order neurons are going to be synapsing from one side of the head with the same side of the head. Oftentimes you'll see that they cross, but in this case they're not going to. But the second set of neurons are going to go from the opposite side and extend into the thalamus. So they're going to have a crossing at the second order neurons. And at the third order neurons, we're going to have impulses again from the thalamus to the primary somatosensory cortex. So again, we're getting to the same location. We're just traveling through multiple different sensory tracts and pathways. And then last but not least, we have the anterior or posterior spinocerebellar tracts. Here's the posterior side, obviously more towards posterior, and the anterior more towards the anterior side. And these are responsible for conveying nerve impulses in the trunk and the lower limb of one's body, again to the same side of the cerebellum. And it's going to be containing proprioceptive input, which is going to then let the cerebellum know what is actually happening in terms of the body movement, allowing it to coordinate and smoothly refine skilled motions, etc., and also involved in maintenance of posture and balance. So if we end up with deterioration or degeneration of the posterior portion of the spinal cord, then we can end up with uncoordinated gait and loss of somatic sensations, because the objective of this region is to pass information up in terms of all of your proprioception and also to interpret that and then send it back out in terms of motor function. Okay, so we have specialty somatic motor pathways. We have nerves that are going to extend out of the brainstem and the spinal cord. These are the lower motor neurons. So that's everything that's from the neck down, basically. And they're going to innervate skeletal muscles of the face and the head through the cranial nerves, and also skeletal muscles of the limb and trunk through spinal nerves. So we have lower and upper neurons. We have the lower circuit neurons. They're located in the lower motor neurons in the brainstem and the spinal cord. And then we also have upper motor neurons, which are from the cerebral cortex, and they're essential. They're from the cerebral cortex and the brainstem, I apologize. And they're essential for the execution of voluntary motions of the body. So it's going to be input to both of the lower circuit neurons and also the lower motor neurons. Additionally, we have basal nuclei neurons. They're going to help assisting in the motion by giving information to the upper motor neurons. And cerebellar neurons, which assist in motion as well by controlling the activity of the upper motor neurons. All right, so this I know is a lot to take in, so we're going to go kind of over it in stepwise. Basically, we're going to start with one. These are our circuit neurons, our local circuit neurons that are in the brainstem and the spinal cord that are going to send information to the lower motor neurons in the common pathway, which sends information to the skeletal muscles. But we have several different parts of regulation of this. So the upper motor neurons are going to regulate the motor centers in the brainstem, as well as the local circuit neurons, as well as the lower motor neurons, right? We also have the motor centers in the brainstem that are regulating information that goes to the cerebellar neurons. That's a back and forth street. And then from there, the cerebellar neurons send information to the thalamus. The thalamus sends information to the sensory and motor and association cortex. These basal nuclei are going to run information from the sensory motor cortex to the thalamus and also to the motor centers in the brainstem. And again, the brainstem is going to be regulating these lower local circuit neurons by way of the upper motor neurons from the brainstem. So it seems a very complicated pathway, but it's a lot of auto-regulation to make sure that input is coming in and is tightly controlled to regulate output. And that's going to help initiate and terminate motions and also suppress unwanted motions and regulate your muscle tone. Okay, so we have upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons, and obviously the upper motor neurons are going to extend out into the lower motor neurons, and they do that through two different types of pathways. They do that from direct motor pathways and indirect motor pathways. So direct pathways are also known as pyramidal pathways, so you'll see that sometimes as well. And direct or pyramidal motor pathways are going to provide information to our lower motor neurons through axons that extend directly from the cerebral cortex. Whereas indirect motor pathways are going to provide information to those lower motor neurons from motor centers inside the brainstem. And all of this is going to be coming from the primary motor area, which is in the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe. And that's going to be the major control region for voluntary motion. So we have two direct motor pathways that are used for voluntary motion. One is the corticospinal pathway, which includes both the lateral and the anterior corticospinal tract, and the corticobulbar pathway. All right, so this is showing you something a little bit similar to what we noticed. I changed the colors so you're not going to get confused with the first, second, and third order neurons. Here we have the upper motor neuron, which is going to be involved in information here, regulating from the pons, etc., up into the brain, which eventually is going to send information into the cerebral cortex. And that lower motor neuron is going to be sending information out to the skeletal muscles at the distal part of the limbs. And in this case, it's going through the lateral corticospinal tract. We also have, I'm going to show you a very similar image in a second, the major difference being that now we're headed through the anterior corticospinal tract, but we're still sending information from the lower motor neurons up to the upper motor neurons into the brain and then back down, whereby we're processing information and regulating the information that goes back out to our skeletal muscles. So the corticospinal axons are going to actually run into the medulla here. And these are called the pyramidal pathways simply because they run through the pyramid of the medulla. And then that's going to end up going through the cerebral peduncle. And this corticospinal pathway is going to be responsible for conducting impulses for all the voluntary motions of the limb and the trunk. All right, we also have the corticobulbar pathway, and the corticobulbar pathway is going to control voluntary motions of the head and the face. So this is going to be more along the lines of, like, say, the cranial nerves. They're going to head out through the facial nerve, hypoglossal nerve, etc. And in the same mechanism, similar mechanism, we have lower motor neurons, which are going to be regulating the skeletal muscle function, which in this case regulates skeletal facial expression. But we have the lower motor neurons that are going to be innervating the muscles themselves and passing that information up to the upper motor neurons, which is going to relay that information into the brain. All right, so again, that's going to control voluntary motions of the head and the face. All right, so we have indirect motor pathways as well. We just talked about direct motor pathways, but indirect pathways are known as extrapyramidal. Why? Because they don't go through the pyramids. But I won't quiz you on that. But their indirect motor pathways are going to include the rubrospinal. The rubrospinal tracts convey information from the red nucleus part of the midbrain to the contralateral skeletal muscles that are going to provide precise voluntary motions of the upper limbs, specifically the distal parts of the upper limbs. We also have the tectospinal tract. The tectospinal tract conveys nerve impulses from what's called the region of the superior colliculus, that's found in the midbrain, to contralateral skeletal muscles, and these are going to involve in reflexes that move your head, your eyes, and your trunk when you have some sort of visual or auditory stimulation. So if you hear something, you might automatically look over just to kind of make sure that you don't have something that is going to cause you danger or harm, even without having a conscious effort to do that. And that's going to go through the tectospinal tracts. We also have the vestibulospinal tracts. These are going to convey nerve impulses from what's called the vestibular nucleus to the ipsilateral. Remember, ipsilateral is going to be on the same side, whereas contralateral is going to be the opposite side. So ipsilateral skeletal muscles of the trunk and proximal parts of the limbs responsible for maintaining posture and balance in response to motion from your head. And then we also have two different types of reticulospinal tracts. We have the lateral and the medial reticular spinal tracts, and these are going to convey information from the reticular formation to the ipsilateral skeletal muscles of the trunk, and that's going to involve the proximal parts of the limbs as well. That's going to be involved in maintaining posture and body balance in response to your motion. So basically, if you move one arm out, you reflexively are going to change your body position so that you're not leaning too far that direction, and so that's going to be involved in maintaining posture and balance when you move your body in one way or another. Oh my goodness, I apologize for that. I got all the way through. Here we go. Nope. There. Apologize for that delay. Okay, so now I'm going to take you through what I just told you previously. So here's our direct pyramidal tracts, and again, they're going to be, this is the corticospinal tract with the lateral and the anterior corticospinal tract, and again, these are called the pyramidal pathways because they go through the pyramid. So the lateral corticospinal pathways are going to convey nerve impulses in the skeletal muscles on opposite sides of the body, which allows for voluntary motions and precision of voluntary motions in the distal part of the limbs. It's also involved in making sure that you are eliminating motion that you don't want to be making, so eliminating excess motion. And these are going to end up going from the precentral gyrus to the cortex into the medulla, where they're going to cross over. So in the medulla, they're going to cross over to the contralateral side. So they're generally going to be crossing over in that second part where you actually have headed into the spinal column. Yep. And then where they terminate, they're going to end the anterior gray horn on the same side, so ipsilateral. So ipsilateral for the first set, contralateral for the middle set, and ipsilateral again for the third set. We also have the anterior corticospinal pathway, and again, it's going to be going through a different region of the corticospinal tract here, and it's going to convey impulses to skeletal muscles on opposite sides of the body. So left for the right brain, right body, left brain, of the trunk and the proximal limbs. And similar pathway, we've got axons of upper motor neurons descending, in this case from the cortex into the medulla. And about 10% of them don't desiccate. They're going to enter into the spinal cord and form this tract. So 90% of them are going to desiccate, but those 10 that don't are going to enter in and form this tract. And they're going to terminate, or the upper motor neurons are going to terminate and end at the anterior gray horn on the opposite side of the body. The corticobulbar tract here is going to convey information from the motor cortex to skeletal muscles of the head and the neck. And again, this is involved in voluntary motion for precision for the voluntary motions. And the axons of these upper motor neurons are going to descend, again, from the cortex into the brainstem. Some are going to desiccate and others are not going to. And they're going to provide information to the lower motor neurons of the ocular motor, trochlear, trigeminal, abductans, facial, glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, and hypoglossal nerves. What are those, you might ask? Those are the cranial nerves, if we haven't had the chance to look at that lecture yet. So the cranial nerves are going to be separate from the spinal nerves, and those are the major cranial nerves, well, all of the cranial nerves. And these are going to help be control voluntary motions of things like the eyes, the tongue, and the neck, chewing, facial expression, and speech. All right. So the indirect tracts are called extrapyramidal because they don't run through the pyramids, and that's really the only reason. We have the rubrospinal tract. Here's the tectospinal tract and the medial reticular spinal tract, lateral reticular spinal tract, and vestibulospinal tract. And these are going to be responsible for taking information, right? And then going to, in this case of the rubrospinal, it's going to convey information from the red nucleus area to contralateral, again, opposite sides, skeletal muscles involved in precision and voluntary motions of the distal parts of the upper limbs. So, like the digits, for example. Your hands. The tectospinal tract is going to take information from the superior colliculus to the contralateral. So again, we're going to opposite sides. So contralateral skeletal muscles that are involved in the reflexes. So they're going to move your head or your eyes or your trunk in response to some sort of auditory or visual stimuli. Again, this is going to help prevent, in the case of there being some sort of danger, you're going to be able to have some sort of ability to be aware of it in advance. Vestibulobulbar spinal. Vestibulospinal tract is going to convey nerve impulses from the vestibular nucleus. That's where we're getting information. It's getting information about head motions from the inner ear, which is involved in balance, right? And it's going to be ipsilateral. Again, that's the same side. So ipsilateral skeletal muscles of the trunk and also proximal parts of the limbs involved in maintenance of posture and balance when you turn your head. And then last but not least, we have the medial and the lateral reticulospinal tracts, which are conveying nerve information from reticular formation to ipsilateral, again, same side, skeletal muscles of your trunk and also the proximal parts of your limbs. And that's involved in posture and regulation of muscle tone in response to the ongoing body motion. So again, if I put my arm out to the right, that means that my body is going to move slightly left so that I'm not overextending to be able to make myself off balance. Okay, I know that was a lot. Don't worry, I'm not going to quiz you on the specifics of any of that. I just want you to understand that we have a lot of different ways in which information can be passed from one part of the body to another. And although we have lots of different tracks, they actually are using very similar pathways. Well, they might be using different pathways, but they're conveying signals in a very similar mechanism. All right. So the cerebellum has 4 major activities. The cerebellum is involved in multiple things, including learning and rapid coordinated skilled motion and maintenance of body posture and balance. So the 4 main aspects of cerebellar function are going to include monitoring intentions for motion. By receiving impulses from the motor cortex and basal nuclei via the pontine nuclei, they're able to have a little bit of a preemptive idea of what the body wants to do next. So monitoring your intentions and then monitoring the actual movement. So when I say monitoring intentions, have you ever like gone to reach for something and then stopped yourself before you and then realized that you actually didn't move at all? You like almost moved. You triggered the idea to move, but then you decided you didn't want to pick up that pencil or you weren't going to open the fridge or whatever. And then you had the thought process of moving, the intention of motion, but you actually didn't move at all. And that's going to be the cerebellum has gotten the trigger to move but didn't actually follow through. We also are going to be able to monitor the actual movement, and then we do that by receiving input from like proprioceptors in your joints, in your muscles, etc. And we can also compare the intentions of the motion with the actual performance by comparing the command signals with sensory information received. And in this way, we're able to say you might have had one step that was a little bit awkward, and then from there, you're able to figure out your gait, right? So you can kind of receive information and monitor and modify the information for the next round to get better at coordination and balance. And then last but not least, sending out that corrective feedback, which is again going to allow us to create a new motion for the next time around. So we are able to correct a motion that might have been incorrect to begin with. Now, this is showing you the different regions of, or the different pathways. Here we have sensory information that's going to be coming in from proprioceptors. We have a lot of different types of proprioceptors, right? Anything that's going to be giving us information from our environment is a proprioceptor. So it can be a stretch receptor, pain receptor, nociceptor, etc. And that's going to be found in muscles, joints, vestibular apparatus, eyes, etc. That information is going to travel up into the cortex of the cerebellum. And it does that by a couple different ways. It can do that either by a direct motor pathway or an indirect motor pathway. In this case, it's shown here through an indirect motor pathway in blue. Well, we can also get there by a direct motor pathway. That information is then going to go out of that cortex. It gets relayed and then passed up into the thalamus. From the thalamus, we can end up engaging corrective feedback right? And then motor areas of the cerebral cortex are going to send information back down to the thalamus, which can then also regulate. It can send information over to the cortex of the cerebellum, so we can end up with a pathway that direction, or it can send it directly through the direct motor pathways, signaling down to the lower motor neurons. So we have motor neurons in the brainstem that are upper motor neurons that are going to be help regulating all of this crosstalk. And then we also have the lower motor neurons, which are going to actually be the ones that are responding to and engaging in corrective action. Okay, so one of the last things I want to talk about here is one of the major functions of the cerebrum is involved in wakefulness and in sleeping. So it's going to be involved in the reticular activating system, also involved in learning and memory, which is going to include the immediate memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory, and also involved in emotional responses. So sleep and wakefulness are integrated functions that are controlled by what we call the reticular activating system. And then we also have the ability to arouse from our sleep, or the awakening from our sleep. And that happens when we have increased activity in our reticular activating system. And that's going to result in arousal, or the result of a state of wakefulness. And we call that consciousness. And when we enter into sleep, we end up with an altered consciousness, or we might even call that a partial unconsciousness. And that's because we have a very low reticular activating system during that time frame. Okay, so I'm going to leave us here because the next step was just talking about different types of sleep disorders, which I don't quiz you on, and learning and memory pathways. So I'm going to have left those out. And I appreciate you guys sticking with me today. That's going to end 151 for Chaminade University. So I do hope to see you all again in 152, and I hope you have a fantastic winter break. I will see you guys again later on. Cheers and happy studying.